And we're live.
Okay, morning folks, afternoon and evening for those of you who are joining us from distant parts of the planet. This is our third class, I believe, of the Global MDP program. And this, the first part is a global classroom. And as usual, we'll be here for the first hour plus, hour and a half, and then each one of the universities will then disband to do their own thing, just as we do at Columbia. And what I'd now like to do is kind of have a fabulous warm welcome to Professor Joshua Castellino. And he's a professor of law and dean of the School of Law at Middlesex University in London. A terrific, really terrific guy whom I've come to know in the last few years as the co-chair of the STSN thematic group on social inclusion, where he has worked tirelessly to put together a really great document. And I think all of you have read an article that he co-wrote based on that. It was really good. It was really great. Thanks, Joshua. Joshua is actually joining us from London. He's actually already both on Skype so that colleagues from China and Pakistan can join, as well as on Google Hangout. So Joshua is going to be speaking to us about kind of the intersection of law development as they play out in social and political spheres. And I believe he does not have a PowerPoint. So all of you have to pay really close attention, because on our discussion, we're going to be quizzing each other on his use of adjectives, adverbs, and so on. So please pay close attention. Okay, Joshua, really thank you for coming in. I know you're a really busy schedule. After this, he's going to be jumping on a plane and coming to New York. So he's going to be here. Joshua, for how long? For a week or less?
24 hours, I'm afraid.
Oh, so sorry. 24 hours in New York. He's going to be joining the Leadership Council meeting. And I'm sure he has meetings at the UN, and then he's going to be heading back. So thank you again, Joshua. So over to you. And let me get out of this, Shweta. So Joshua, you have around 45 minutes to an hour. And I believe you have been briefed on the intricacies of Google Hangout with being able to answer those, bring up the questions and answer them.
I have indeed been briefed on it. How good I am, and that's another matter altogether, of course. But thank you, Shiv. It's a real honor and privilege to be at your class, and especially in this class, in this environmentally friendly context that we're doing it in. And I really appreciate that. And thank you, students in Beijing and in London and in New York for joining me.
Joshua, can I ask one thing? Colleagues from Tsinghua, could you please mute your, hello, could you please mute your speaker? Yeah, could you please mute your microphone?
Brilliant.
Professor Chengfi, could you have your students, is that done now? Okay, yep, go ahead.
Great, so thank you very much. And students in New York and Beijing, thank you for bearing with the technology, and I hope that what I'm going to say to you will give you some insights into the process. Now, when Shivan initially contacted me with this particular idea, he wanted me to speak about inclusive peace and sustainable development. And of course, that translates to several of the goals. I'm going to be focusing a little bit on goal 4, on education, on 5 quite a lot, and that's the gender goal. A little bit on 8, which is talking about sustainable growth, quite a lot on 9, on reducing inequality. And then I want to speak about, of course, inclusive peace itself, which is goal 16. To be able to do that, I want to structure my presentation. There's no video I beg your pardon. Sorry, now there should be some now. Is that okay in Beijing? Right. Okay, so I want to structure essentially my presentation to give it some degree of coherence into 5 distinct bits. I want to speak at first about the background to the SDGs, what the MDGs have achieved and not achieved, perhaps a little bit on the context of human rights and where it fits into that. I want to introduce you then to some concepts that I think are fundamental if we're going to have any discussion about it. I want to speak to you a little bit about the vision of human rights and why I think something far greater is necessary. So this is my justification for the SDGs and for engaging the development and human rights communities.
We have to make it happen.
And the fourth element I want to speak of then are the goals themselves. And finally, I'll have a few comments on pathways. The pathways that we've spoken about, that's pathways that I will speak about are, of course, in the journal article that was prescribed to you in the reading. So, I think there's an issue with Beijing. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me in Beijing? They can see me in Beijing, but I'm not sure they can hear me. So I'm going to continue.
We can see you and hear you.
Perfect.
But is there a PPT available?
No, there's no PowerPoint. I just explained that the structure that I'm going to speak of, essentially the lecture itself is divided into 5 distinct components. I'll give you a bit of a background. I'll speak a little bit about some of the concepts. I'll talk about the human rights model and why I think it's failed. And then I'll speak a little bit about the goals and finish with pathways. The 5th bit of it, pathways, of course, is in the prescribed reading in the Washington International Law Journal. Okay, pleasure. So just to start off with the background, I think it's important to go back to first principles here and understand the purpose of the United Nations itself. And if you read the UN law and if you read the UN institutions, you will often find it described as 4 pillars that underpin the UN structure. And those 4 pillars, of course, are, first of all, peace and security. Second, the concept of human rights. Third, the concept of the rule of law. And fourth, the concept of development. So these are the 4 pillars that are often described as forming the edifice on which the UN itself is based. Now, it's important to bear in mind in the ranking of these that peace and security does come at the top. And this is, of course, crucial for us in the context of today's topic on inclusive peace, because how you structure these and the priorities you ascribe to them inevitably means that the UN is going to spend a far greater proportion of its time dealing with peace and security questions than it is likely to spend on human rights, rule of law, or development questions. So I think this is the first point to really bear in mind. The difficulty, of course, of the UN structure and the way it has been set out, if you look at the most used phrase in the United Nations Charter of 1945, it is in fact the phrase international peace and security. Of course, it follows then, and it's a clear indication of UN priorities, that the most powerful body within the United Nations family is in fact that body charged with the maintenance of peace and security. So you have this is completely and entirely consistent with the fact that you are trying to generate, you're trying to generate a system by which the maintenance of peace and security is fundamental. And as a consequence, the human rights, rule of law, and development agendas necessarily follow that particular trend. I think that's important to bear in mind in the context of a background. The main reason for that, of course, is your inquiry today is on the issue of inclusive peace. So what it says immediately to us is that even though you're looking at this in the context of sustainable development, the real emphasis on the peace and security agenda tends to come within the mandate of the Security Council. And that already gives you something of a structural, I guess, critique as to why it is that the issue of sustainable development, inclusive peace, and human rights don't always make pleasant bedfellows. Okay, so I hope that that bit is clear enough. I want to talk a little bit now about the concepts that underpin it. The concepts that I want to introduce and briefly discuss. First of all, this notion of inclusive peace and full lives. And this is, of course, a comment that you have in your reading materials, and this is the topic of today's class. Inclusive peace is an interesting concept. It's very much an aspiration that when you look at the United Nations Charter, and if you put yourself back to 1945 and San Francisco and the signing of this particular charter, you have global leaders coming together on the ruins of the world at the end of World War II, saying we need to dedicate ourselves to maintaining international peace and security. If you look at the UN Charter, it says things like having witnessed the scourge of warfare twice in our lifetimes, being committed to peace and security. All of these notions are thrown in there. Now, of course, peace in the context of how the UN Charter treats it is very much the absence of war. It's very much this notion that when a dispute arises between two or more nations, that dispute will somehow be regulated through what a former Secretary of State official in the US described as the argument of force, the force of argument, and not the argument of force. So you want to create a dynamic by which genuine difficulties between states in the course of their statecraft will be aired and viewed and discussed in a manner that is pacific in its principle. While that notion exists of peace quite narrowly configured, it means we don't so much worry about the general human condition that you as scholars of development studies worry much more about. You don't worry about the extent to which inequality persists in society. You don't necessarily worry about the extent to which it's in fact vulnerable groups, women, children, but minorities, ethnic communities, indigenous peoples. You don't quite worry if you take a narrow definition of what is peace. You don't quite worry about the fact that these are the groups that tend to be in the front line of war and conflict. And what we have seen in the world since 1945 is a vast slew of populations and countries coming under the influence of conflict, and the limited tools of peace and security we have, mainly through the Security Council, unable to really tackle that. I mean, the refugee crisis that we are currently facing in Europe is a case in point, but many others. And of course, I want to highlight that while this refugee crisis is gaining airtime on screen, certainly in Europe, and quite possibly in the United States of America, and quite possibly in China, in fact, the flow of people from one border to another sovereign state has become quite a reality in parts of Africa and in parts of the Middle East, Lebanon being a case in point. So this notion of an inclusive peace and a full life is a very important concept. And in the way you try to define it, you are already at cross purposes with how the UN tends to think about peace and security. But that's a point worth bearing in mind. Now, in the context of back to that context of 1945 and the establishment of the United Nations Charter, when you think about what it was that the United Nations Charter was trying to achieve vis-a-vis peace broadly defined, that is the peace that you're thinking of, as opposed to the peace the Security Council is concerned about, the closest you get, the closest instrument you get to that is in fact the human rights agenda. It is the second pillar in terms of the UN family, and really the UN human rights agenda was premised on, if you look at the legal language that's used, premised on the creation of systems that maintain the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. I'll say that again. The entire system is premised on trying to design mechanisms, policies that will seek to protect the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. What is dignity? What is worth? Why is it equal? Should it be every individual? Should it be those who contribute to society? What about the elderly? What about the disabled? What about women in certain situations? Essentially, the idea of human rights was really this notion that you would focus in the context of worrying about international peace and security on questions of justice, on questions that seek social justice, on mechanisms and principles and institutions that will actively promote the quest for justice. So that's where the human rights notion comes in, and I want to return to that a little bit later in my lecture to you. Suffice to say that in the context of how the Millennium Development Goals were conceived, there appeared to be little room for human rights in that particular language. Now, there was plenty of focus on particular vulnerabilities. The girl child gets a mention. There was plenty of focus on women. There was focus on a general condition that's necessary with regards to education and health for all. But the language of human rights itself wasn't necessarily paid attention to, and that's partly because of the problematic view in which some states look at human rights. So, and that needs to be addressed up front, because there are states that have argued for the longest time that human rights is a mechanism that essentially regulates or seeks to regulate the relationship between citizens within a state and their government. And when you start talking about that regulating the relationship between citizens and a government, what happens is you go full stream ahead in the headlight beams of the notion of state sovereignty. So when you think about the international community, you think of it as sovereign states, and you have to accept that the principle of state sovereignty means that every single sovereign state will have exclusive jurisdiction, exclusive power, exclusive mandate to determine what rules, what laws should be applicable in their given state. The difficulty when you try to talk about transnational human rights is it goes against the grain of state sovereignty. Because now you're no longer saying it's the government of Sudan that has the exclusive right to make regulations that are applicable in Sudan, or that the government of China has the exclusive rights to make regulations that govern relations between citizens and the government in China or India or US and vice versa, and various others. What you are in fact saying is that human rights is a transnational global concept that attaches itself to every individual, irrespective of their location and irrespective of the jurisdiction, i.e. the territory in which they fall. And that flies to a certain extent in the face of state sovereignty. Because states argue correctly that according to the UN Charter, and for those of you who are so minded, you can look up the authority, it's Article 2.7 of the United Nations Charter. Article 2.7 of the United Nations Charter, and I'm going to more or less quote it to you, says something to the effect of, and I quote, "Nothing contained in the present charter will allow the United Nations or any member state to interfere in matters within the domestic jurisdiction of states." So nothing contained in the present charter will allow the United Nations or any member state to intervene in matters within the domestic jurisdiction of states. Now there's a caveat, and that caveat concerns Chapter 7 and the Security Council, but that's not strictly relevant to our conversation today. So what you have there is a dynamic by which transnational human rights law, which is trying to attach itself to every individual, irrespective of where they are, coming into full opposition to the notion of state sovereignty. Now, I should say that the argument to a certain extent has been defeated, and it's been defeated because states of their own volition have accepted human rights principles and have agreed to bind themselves to these human rights treaties that exist. And if you have questions on those, I can talk about them in due course. But in the context of where we are with regards to the sustainable development goals that are about to be unveiled, the fundamental question that lawyers would ask is, yes, these goals have now come into being through a massive process of negotiation, really going all the way back to 2010, 2011. What is their legal status? To what extent do these goals, in fact, create binding obligations upon the states that exist within the international community? And that's really an answer that we can't give in any coherent sense, because there's much to play for in terms of how we configure those obligations, in terms of who is likely to take ownership of those obligations, and of course, the big question, what are going to be the consequences of failing those obligations? So that concludes my section on the concepts, just to give you a conceptual background in terms of the relevant applicable law and the frameworks that govern this area. I want to go in my third part of this presentation to talk a little bit about human rights and why it has failed in many ways to give us this inclusive peace that we seek. So let me start off by saying, if human rights were indeed successful in maintaining the inherent dignity and worth of every individual globally, we would be less concerned about the human condition when it got to configuring the Sustainable Development Goals. So that would give us a legitimate ground to focus on the planetary boundary issues we face, on the loss of biodiversity, and on the several other challenges, the multiple challenges that we face across the board. But partly the failure to really configure global legal systems adequately to protect the human dignity and worth of every individual means that this has to be a fundamental aspect of the planning process. Well, mainly because, of course, if you project business as usual forward, what you will find immediately is that if there's likely to be a run on resources, if there is likely to be fewer and fewer resources available, then you can take it for granted that the more powerful will be able to access the fewer resources there are. That can't be a mechanism or a formula for an inclusive peace. It can't even be a formula for a stable society. I would argue we've already begun to see this happening. For me, the impetus towards the Arab Spring was really the failure within many Arab states to decolonize effectively. It was the failure within those states to extend the rule of law and human rights to every individual within those jurisdictions. And as a consequence, many people within the Middle East feeling they were second-class citizens compared to others. And I think this is this element of inequality, this element of lack of access to resources becomes then a driving force, which through the ethos of social media begins to give voice to masses that have hitherto been silent. So for me, that's one of the failures of the human rights regime. Partly the human rights regime has failed because of the fact that it has focused quite heavily on what we call in legal speak, the civil and political rights element. So we have worried quite a lot about the extent to which I appear to have lost Beijing. I do beg your pardon. I'm not distracted. I'm just trying to resume a conversation with Beijing. Do bear with me. So essentially, we have this. We have a system by which you focus and you emphasize this discussion on an inclusive piece, and you ensure that that inclusive piece necessarily worries about the full extent of the human condition. If you place an exclusive emphasis, as has happened before, on civil and political rights, what you inevitably find is that civil and political rights get you into the realm of political participation and various other sets of rights, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, etc. But they don't necessarily address fundamental questions about human frailty. They don't address questions around the right to food. It doesn't address questions around the right to education, doesn't necessarily address questions around the right to livelihoods. Failure to do that essentially means that you are always going to reproduce structural schisms that exist in society. If you don't tackle those structural elements, you're not going to get an inclusive peace. So the human rights agenda has, partly out of its own emphasis on law and the rule of law and working through legal mechanisms, failed to address that broader question of what needs to really happen if we're going to get into the realm of creating inclusive peace. So that brings me then to the goals. That concludes my brief interlude, I guess, on the human rights model. I'm happy to answer any questions that may arise. In the context of a lecture like this, of course, I can only give you flavors of some of these discussions, and I'm hoping that if you have questions, you can ask me in the Google Hangouts or through other means. Turning to the goals themselves and how it is that they are reflected, and Shiv asked me here to speak about essentially goal 4 on education, 5 on gender, 8 on growth, and 16 on peace. I would like to add to the mix goal 10, because I think goal 10 is quite a fundamental element here, and goal 10 really tackles inequality. If you hear Jeffrey Sachs speak about these goals, and I'm sure you've already had that particular privilege, and if you haven't, I'm sure you're likely to have it very soon, he would describe the eradication of poverty as a marquee goal. And I completely agree with that assertion. This notion that you have to eradicate poverty in our lifetimes is probably one of the most urgent challenges we face, because without doing that, anything else we might do won't really address the entirety of our population, global population. But for me, goal 1 has a flip side, and that goal 1, the flip side of that really is goal 10. Reduce inequality within and among countries. And I think this is an interesting one to frame. It's been interesting, of course, because the moment you start talking about inequality, you begin to make people who are extremely wealthy extremely uncomfortable. So this really asks fundamental questions about the structure of the framing of goals. It asks fundamental questions about whether a process that's framed in these particular terms, exalted processes that involve the United Nations, mayors, state representatives, whether that really is the best forum to tackle questions of inequality, when clearly, animal farm analogies notwithstanding, everybody in that room is already equal. Yes, there may be some that are more equal than others, but the really unequal people aren't really in that particular room. So it's been a real challenge to be able to frame something on equality that talks to this issue. Of course, inequality is something of a zeitgeist, you would argue. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Thomas Piketty's book on inequality, this long and very dense longitudinal analysis of Britain and France. But there's plenty of lessons in that particular book that are worth emphasizing. And among them is this facet that inequality is a major challenge we face. And I would argue that inequality is not only a major challenge we face, it's actually a challenge that affects particular types of populations, what I would define as vulnerable groups. In some circumstances, that is the entire population of women, but in many circumstances, it's ethnic, linguistic, religious, indigenous communities, possibly migrant communities, refugee communities that exist above and beyond the pale of law. Now, if law is a weapon that we are using to advocate for this social justice, and there are excluded populations that have no access to that particular weapon or that particular tool, then what we have essentially created in the human rights world is a club of those who already have. And to be honest, they already have it to the extent that they don't necessarily need the articulation of very expensive legal counsel to defend those particular rights. If, on the other hand, we are serious about the planning agenda looking towards 2030 and beyond, then tackling inequality becomes a fundamental issue. Tackling inequality on a micro scale within societies, the extent to which there's wealth and the extent to which there's poverty, but tackling inequality also on the global scale in the context of the rich North and the poor South, to use a possibly overused cliche. And that also brings me to goal 16 and why goal 16 has a role to play in the articulation of these particular aspects. So what we are looking to do here is to promote, in the words of goal 16, peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And I think that's quite important. It's quite loaded. And I would argue goal 16 encompasses quite a lot of what it is I'm going to say to you and what it is the message I want to get across to you. So this notion of promote inclusive and peaceful societies, you do need to bear in mind as development studies scholars that the way in which you would necessarily see inclusive peace and inclusive societies isn't necessarily how the UN structure sees peace. In the UN structure speak, in the words of the UN Charter, which is still the defining authority on the subject, peace still is the absence of war, and the break and the threat of peace is still dealt with by the Security Council, who by and large have not found themselves to be overtly in favor of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And that's probably putting it lightly. In any case, what is clear in the words of goal 16 is this notion of providing access to justice for all. That for me is a key element. It encompasses gender equality, it encompasses education, access to health, and a whole gamut of other goals that are already concerned and that are already reflected here. So in many ways, goal 16 is something of a meta goal there that is talking about several other elements to it. The other aspect of it, access to justice, I think needs to be emphasized there. If we are talking about global justice here, we need to find mechanisms that will allow vulnerable groups and those furthest away from sites to power to access the global justice that we aspire to and that this particular document reflects. If the only tool in the box is law, and if the only tool in the box is legislation, you are already addressing your question to two groups that are particularly well endowed and not necessarily high, that don't necessarily have high on the agenda the issue of exclusion. By that, of course, I mean the legal community, because if you're looking at getting remedies through courts of law, you need to have access to the lawyer. You need to be able to, the lawyer needs to be able to understand your situation, needs funding to be able to pay for that particular defense, assuming, of course, that you can't. And legislature. Legislature, now in theory, we talk about legislatures being representative. In practice, you actually find that legislators are drawn from a very, very small percentage of the population. And so to that extent, don't necessarily reflect the broader interests and the broader challenges that society faces. So that's an element there. Now, in the human rights world, when we think of what change do we require states to make, we ask for them to reconfigure their legislative, judicial, and administrative systems. So we say, if you want to support, let's say, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is a current global standard, that particular document, by signing and ratifying and by agreeing to be bound by those principles, what you are agreeing as a state is to make the necessary changes to your legislation. So pass laws. Where your laws are in foul of the current standard, change them. It might seem easy, but of course, many states still have discriminatory regimes, for instance, on citizenship and women. And that's quite common across the globe. On property rights, several existing discriminations within the law. So those legislations need to be changed. New legislation needs to be passed. You need to be able to address judicial measures. You need to be able to have some mechanism by which somebody whose right has been violated can in fact address that violation to a judicial body. That assumes that your judiciary are in a state that will understand the plight, the human condition that exists within their societies. Not every jurisdiction can say very honestly that their judiciary necessarily do. So that's an element there too. The third element, which is often ignored, is the administrative measures. And this basically means that in their social policy, states are required to produce the methods and the means by which their aspirations for global justice can be met with the reality that they are trying to create. So goal 16 is packed full of a number of aspects, and for that reason really is a meta goal. Hopefully I've said something about why number 10 is important, and just briefly about number 8 then. Goal 8, this notion that you have to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. This is probably going to be the fundamental challenge on the human side of how successful this agenda is going to be. If society does not generate the kinds of employment and the kinds of means that will enable communities to be fully inclusive, that will enable communities to fully participate in that global economy, you're going to get into a haves and have-not situation. Inevitably, you have to tackle what it is that the have-nots have not. And now one of the things they have not, of course, would be access to finance. But if you are going to design a system that essentially gives handouts to these particular people, you're going to create antagonisms, and you're inevitably, whether you like it or not, going to create a two-tier system or a multi-tiered system. That would go against the basic premise of maintaining the human dignity and worth of all. So decent work becomes quite a fundamental aspect. And in our paper, we talk about decent work in a much broader lens, including talking about work within the household and how it's valued, which of course becomes crucial to assessing and ascertaining the legitimate role that women already play in a society, a role that we don't fully acknowledge by our narrow articulations of gross domestic product. And I think that is partly the challenge that we're facing as well. So that particular meta goal is reflected in a number of other issues. And that would be a challenge that we need to address. I'm just going to have somebody re-log in for me on Skype because we appear to have lost Chingwa. So, and of course, these elements are equally applicable, whether we talk about the education goal in number 4 or the gender goal in number 5. And I think those are aspects worth bearing in mind, just in terms of how we configure our pathways to this element. The final bit then, in the remaining 6 or 7 or 4 or 5 minutes that I appear to have, is to talk about some pathways. And again, I'm less concerned about getting into the detail of these because they are articulated in the reading in the Washington International Law Journal. But these are a bunch of suggestions on how it is that this ambitious agenda can actually be tackled. For us, one of the things that you need to look at in the context of how global planning has transpired and the impact of global planning is it increasingly has relied on perhaps less than 1% of global society. Number of communities are excluded. Number of different groups are excluded. Women are in many societies excluded entirely. In other societies, the legislators, the innovators, the technologists, the business people, the educators, the lawyers, the judges, all seem to come from what is effectively 1% of that society. The question we pose is to tackle challenges at this particular level. Is that sustainable? Can we not and ought we not to rely on the entirety of the human experience and not just the experience of the 1%? Because the challenges we face are multi-layered, and the solutions will necessarily need to be multi-layered. So that's our first point on the exclusion. Our second point really is the importance of political participation of women. I think this is partly to do with the fact that women are underrepresented anyway in global parliaments. I mean, try this. Go on to Google Images and try to find images of world parliaments. You will see the first thing you notice is that these are dominated by men. So apologies, Beijing, we seem to have lost you for quite a bit of that. Can you hear me now? There's a playback going on in Beijing that I'm not quite sure about. I'm going to continue. So the political participation of women becomes very important, and partly to change the system, partly to ask fundamental questions about how power is structured, and partly, of course, to bring in the views of 50% of the population, which generally tends to be underrepresented. The third element we talk about is decent work. And here we ask for a recalibration of how work is measured. If we necessarily measure work in the narrow sense that we have in the context of framing GDPs, we inevitably undervalue women's work, we undervalue part-time workers, we undervalue those casual and seasonal workers who contribute to economies, and we don't seem to have a method to be able to capture that. Inevitably, that has consequences for the individuals concerned because they are seen as not necessarily contributing to society. So that's the third element, the third pathway we talk about. We talk about the importance of getting macroeconomic policy right. Again, macroeconomic policy tends to be contained to a realm of a very small proportion of individuals who then determine what the priority should be. Yet, macroeconomic policies ought to be broadly configured to take into account the entirety of the human condition. Social protection measures. These have come under various pressures in recent years. So there's been quite a momentum towards talking about social thresholds, and people like Piketty have helped in the context of framing those, basically arguing that there is an absolute minimum that individuals need to sustain themselves. But that has come under pressure in many developing states and developed states, mainly because of austerity measures. So austerity measures have often allowed the state to abdicate its responsibility in crucial areas, in health, in housing, in education, in provision of basic services that the state is meant to or ostensibly tries to provide. And that has had a major impact because the vulnerable have got more vulnerable. And I would argue that any attempt at even understanding the security implications of that vulnerability need to be uppermost in our mind. You don't build a glass house in the middle of a slum. You have to tackle those particular issues. If you have any aspirations to your glass house surviving, you need to find ways in which you can tackle that. And social protection for us in our paper is a fundamental means through which you do that. Then there's the aspect of factors of production. So it's not enough to treat the vast masses of people who are disenfranchised as merely hungry mouths to be fed by the well-endowed. You can't rely on charity because charity is necessarily going to be a limited tool. You need to instead reconfigure your system in order to ensure that people who are unrepresented in groups that are far away from sites of power have at their behest the factors of production to help themselves. That means asking serious questions about land tenure systems. That means asking serious questions about access to credit. Those two fundamental factors of production that you probably learned in a very basic economics class that you would have done are in fact beyond the realm of quite a large proportion, quite large swathes of population. And again, here it is perhaps our colleagues in China. There's been a lot of thinking on this issue in the context of China and rural poverty. And again, some of the models that China is trialing there would probably be worth studying in greater detail. But simply leaving the issue of factors of production up to market forces automatically means it's going to be a limited tool in the empowerment of the wide swathe of people we're talking about. Just to run through a few more, and I'm going to terminate then and go on to some of the questions that you may have sent me. Registration of births. We've put that down because actually we noticed that in the context of UNCTAD and various other groups, the failure to register a child when the child is actually born ultimately condemns them to a life of anonymity with regards to state. That means they have no access to justice, they have no access to basic services, they have no access to being fully fledged members of the human community. So something as simple, and there's examples given in the paper about what Vietnam did with this, something as simple as a mobile registration unit can solve those particular issues. So we actually go away from assuming that everybody is fully represented in society to actually ensuring that they are. I think that's an important shift in our perspective. The next points are interrelated. The access to information, access to paralegals. These are really about ensuring that people understand what rights accrue to them by virtue of being human, and then have the means to access them. The emphasis that we put on paralegals, of course, is to get over the issue of cost. Legal counsel is expensive, and legal counsel often is beyond the realm of the kinds of excluded groups we're talking about. We've highlighted once again the issue of gross domestic violence and gross violence against women. I think this is important as a statement, because if you don't tackle that particular issue and understand that women can't necessarily play a full role in an inclusive society, if in some cultures and some societies and some individual households they are perceived as being somehow less equal, and in that a fundamental aspect of their dignity really is to make sure that there's strong elements that protect against gross bodily harm. I think that's an element that we've stressed in there. Finally, just to say that if we are going to tackle this agenda from a legal perspective, I want you to consider one fact, I would argue. There's about 193, 194 sovereign states in the world. They've all got constitutions and legal systems. But guess what? Those legal systems tend to derive from 5 or 6 different constitutions. Those legal constitutions and those legal structures really derive from the experience of the United States of America, remodeled in many places, the experience of Britain, which of course doesn't even have a written constitution, the experience of Germany, of France, of Italy. Anything beyond that, and you're looking at slightly more adventurous states. Now, the fundamental aspect here is that many of the societies, many of the post-colonial states that are 50, 60, 70 years old are very different in terms of their socioeconomic backgrounds to the states that I've just mentioned. So we need to find mechanisms and learn from each other. If sustainable development policy, I said to you earlier, has largely been considered by the 1% for the 99%, it's probably equally true that legal systems have been configured by the 1% states for the 99% others. Decolonizing that and unraveling those barriers that exist is going to be fundamental if we are going to create an ideal legal infrastructure to support the ambitious goals that we have with regards to sustainable development. So I hope that I've given you some insight into those particular aspects, and I hope that you've enjoyed the reading. Thank you very much for engaging with me through this medium. My apologies to Beijing, who I think we may have now lost in the context of this. Now, I have a number of questions that have been put forward, and I want to just turn to that. So a question here from Zota Zungu. Thank you, Zota. Is global justice or the notion of inclusive peace an attainable UN goal, or just an ambitious attempt that works only in theory with no enforcement mechanisms? And I think you're referring there to cases in South Africa, the failure to capture al-Bashir, all of those aspects. It's an excellent question. Let me answer it in 2 guises. Let me say to you, the first bit of your question, is it an attainable goal or just an ambitious attempt? Let me say to you, it is an ambitious attempt, straight away. So I'm giving you a straightforward answer there, saying this is an ambitious attempt. But let me get you to consider what the alternative is. If we are sitting in 2015 and projecting forward to 2030 and beyond to 2050, if we don't set those kinds of ambitious goals and start making the structural changes we need to make that goal a reality, we may as well just accept the fact that the world will continue on the path of business as usual. What that means, of course, you've probably explored what that means in terms of the environment and the climate change. I'm not going to tackle that particular issue. What it means in terms of my interest is that the powerful will get more powerful, that the more powerful states will look at less powerful states as essentially colonial enterprises through which they can exploit resources. Remember, we've been here before. So in a sense, yes, it's an ambitious goal, but it's absolutely worth articulating. Now, the other element of your question, is it attainable? The honest answer to that is I don't know. Strategically, I would recommend, and I recommend this to my students when I'm speaking to them about these issues, strategically, it is important we get behind these goals, because actually human agency can account for a lot. The systems that we have inherited are not systems that came down on a tablet of stone from anywhere. They are systems we designed. So it will fall to us to redesign those systems. And for me, part of my goal individually is to make sure that there are enough people like you, Zota, and others, who are interested and keen to make sure that societies are inclusive and to make sure that you keep empowering them to get to the position where you can make this kind of change. Because I do think that particular change is possible. Is it attainable in 2015? Looking forward at the structures that I see before me and the structures that you see around you at the UN and other places, the answer is no, they're not attainable. But why are we assuming that 2030's world will look like 2015? Why are we assuming that our human agency collectively can't change those structures? Decolonization has come, the Berlin Wall has fallen, Nelson Mandela walked free. There are plenty of examples in human history of immense odds stacked against this agenda that have actually been overcome. So my message to you will be, my answer to your question will be, is it attainable? Well, in the short term, no. But is it a standard that's worth aspiring to and ambitious? Absolutely it is. And it will fall to us to make this happen. So I hope I've addressed that to a certain extent. I have another question here. While the SDGs, thank you, Aishwarya. While the SDGs in their present form allow for national level action, how do you foresee nations prioritizing and eradicating some social inclusion issues which are not inherently recognized by their social cultural fabric? And you've given the example, Aishwarya, thank you very much for that, on marital rape in India. And I think, again, a very, very good question, as I would really expect from you. Yes, absolutely. The difficulty that you're pointing to falls into the realm of what I talked about between human rights on one hand and state sovereignty on the other. You do have this belief among states that they are the sole arbiters of what happens in their particular territory. So the argument is essentially some social injustice takes place in the state. It's the state who has the primary responsibility towards addressing that particular issue. Social inclusion and social exclusion by its very nature keeps certain groups away from power. That means that the chances of those particular groups influencing power to address the question already becomes difficult. The aspect, though, is very much the question as well as to how much this can be changed by changes in approach mentally and at cultural level, and how much of this can be enforced by a state through laws. So some behaviors can be changed through laws, but not all behaviors. The death penalty can be abolished by law, and the state can make sure, for instance, that it no longer executes individuals. But can something like marital rape be changed through law? Well, yes, the law already in most countries, in every country, is clear. We've moved a long way from the era and the ethos that really articulated that women were no more than chattel. They belonged to the man, and the man could do whatever he wanted to them. And of course, the notion that what happens behind the closed door is private. We've broken down those elements in terms of how we frame the law. But of course, the practice continues. And that practice continuing has less to do with how the law is framed and much more to do with the social ethos in which societies operate. This particular question and various other manifestations of that question come to the fore in the human rights world, where you have states arguing, oh, but it's part of our culture. And my argument to that always is straightforward. First of all, tackling cultural discussions in the human rights world is extremely problematic, because you're essentially saying to some people, I'm sorry, look, that may be your cultural practice, but that cultural practice is wrong and needs to be changed. My starting point on this often is, why do you assume that culture is static? Why is it that you assume that just because you've practiced in this particular way, that practice somehow needs to be preserved and portrayed and projected into the future? Let's examine the issue of marital rape. Let's examine the issue of genital mutilation. Is it a cultural practice? I would argue it's not. I would argue both are instances of violence against women. The issue of genital mutilation is all about ensuring that the woman remains the possession of the man and won't necessarily have any individual experience of sexual awareness. And it will remain linked to the man and the marital connection in which she is. Same with marital rape. So in many ways, that's not a culture. That's an aspect of domination of one over another. That's a classic example of a violation of a woman's rights. That's a classic example of a gross violence against women. That's a classic example of a culture of domination. Culture of domination is still a culture, but it's not a culture that's in line with human rights principles. And it fundamentally defeats the notion of the equality, the built-in equality we now all accept in our legal systems between women and men. So I think hopefully that goes some way towards addressing your questions. Now, some questions coming thick and fast, so I might just speed up my own answer for them. And apologies to you for that. Pilar, thank you for your questions. What legal remedies have been more effective to fight against human rights violations? The world of human rights essentially has relied quite heavily on law, and let me give you a caricature. Typically, the human rights world has relied on the lone, articulate advocate who takes on power with all its manifestations and wins a dramatic victory by great rhetoric in a court of law. That is something of a caricature, but that is in many ways where the biggest victories have come. So, for instance, I work with colleagues in India at the Human Rights Law Network, you might want to look them up, who have won a famous case on the right to food in 2002. And that particular case compels the government of India to actually provide a midday meal scheme to women lactating mothers and children in school. Lots of downstream benefits, ensuring children's attendance in school, etc., etc. So it has tended to be, Pilar, in the context of courts of law where dramatic human rights violations have been addressed. But in fact, what you get in courts of law are necessarily a drop in the ocean, because actually the really vulnerable populations have not been able to get those kinds of landmark decisions. The other one that's often talked about in the same breath as the right to food case is, of course, the access to retrovirals in South Africa. Two very, very famous cases, lots of materials on Google Web and on various other different databases on that particular aspect. I would say that what we do need in terms of legal remedies is to move away from reliance on the judiciary and legislature and to move into the realm of administrative mechanisms. Create robust social policy mechanisms that you can access on a day-to-day basis and not in the context of a violation. Because the moment the violation has occurred, and the moment you have become a victim of that particular violation, you are automatically restricted in what means you have to address that particular violation. And your ability, I guess, to speak truth to power becomes more difficult. If, on the other hand, the state pays attention to configuring its social policy mechanisms in such a way that you don't need to speak truth to power, then you can access your rights as a matter of course and not as a matter of exception. So that's the element I would stress on. A number of other questions then. I'm going to Yunmi Song's question. Thank you, Yunmi. You've asked a question there as to, I've lost it. Oh yeah, how can we achieve world peace if in many cases it depends on the equity of resources for people, if it has not been possible in the current capitalist system? Look, that's a fantastic and much broader question. What I would say for my part is that emphasizing this notion of growth for all is important, because beyond that, you're never going to be able to get developing states to sign on to an agenda that restricts growth. But configuring that growth through technology and through other means to ensure that it's available to all is crucial. It is necessarily a tiny step, because what you're asking is the current capitalist system set up for it? In my opinion, no, but it's not going to fall to me or necessarily the likes of you to be able to reconfigure that particular system, whether we think it's desirable or not. So what we need to do is gradually move questions of conscience to the front. We need to frame our arguments as pragmatically as possible. So for instance, if I'm talking to states, I did this recently, spoke at the parliament in Bahrain. You may be familiar. Bahrain is going through major upheaval, major issues on torture. My message to them was not don't torture. That message hopefully is clear and loud and clear from everybody else. My message to them was, look at who gets tortured. It tends to be men between the age of 19 and 35. They tend to be from one particular community. Think about the pragmatic aspects of this. First of all, can you afford to have men who are likely to be important in production and important in generating wealth? Can you afford to have them all locked up to that extent? The fact that they all come from the same community, I mean, can you afford to have that antagonism played out in society? What is that going to have? So I'm not saying that we necessarily would necessarily convert people based on pragmatic argument, but I tend to think, in my personal experience, that talking down to states from the moral high ground isn't the way to go. Understanding states' pressure points and understanding why it is that they can better configure their systems would. Now, I have no doubt in my mind. I mean, the lack of torture is not suddenly going to break out across the world as a consequence of what I have said. But essentially, if we start framing our arguments in a much more pragmatic sense, we will automatically engage states' agenda, because no state really steps out to try and be the naughty girl or naughty boy of the class. States end up there as a consequence of the power mechanisms that they've inherited, and the power mechanisms that they necessarily need to preserve, because it's about preserving themselves. So I hope that addresses your question to some extent, and apologies if it doesn't. I'm afraid time is running short, and I've got a number of other questions I also want to touch on. So a question then from Yunmi Song, I think another question from you. How can human rights obligations work and have legal power in communities which might not agree the global obligation, have different cultural laws, rules, etc.? A very, very good question. And I hope partly addressed through my comments on cultural relativism. Let me give you a straightforward example. A few years ago in Peru, there was a famous discovery of a non-contact tribe. So this is an indigenous group that lived in the Amazon that either through their own volition or through not knowing had no desire or no access to the outside world. And they were described in anthropological literature as non-contact. But the first thing that happened once they were described was TV cameras descended upon them. And various individuals then tried to make contact. So you have there almost a sui generis entity who decides to stay out of a system, either through their own volition or through lack of access. And then you have attempts to find out, but really, are you sure you want to stay outside the system? And that's problematic. And in many ways, articulating for indigenous communities is a bit like that. Articulating for the vast communities that don't necessarily have voice is a challenging task. All I can say to you is that the human rights agenda has changed. At the start, the human rights agenda focused very much on laissez-faire economic countries' interests. So the basic goal was provide the 4 freedoms. I mean, President Roosevelt was key in articulating the 4 freedoms. Of course, one of the 4 freedoms is freedom from want, but that was quickly, I guess, relegated. And the more important questions became freedom from fear and the other freedom of expression and the other freedoms. So we have come a long way from where we understood human rights to be just the civil and political rights, to now accepting that human rights are necessarily indivisible. They include the social, economic, cultural, civil and political elements of the human condition. That having been said, you're absolutely right. There are a number of communities who haven't consented in any real form to the creation of these particular roles. And it's individuals like me and many, many generations of people like me in the past who have sought to articulate those views. How well we've done it, I don't know. It perhaps isn't very clear how well we've done it. I'd like to think that my emphasis on looking at vulnerable groups and communities is a better way of doing it. But is it an ideal way? I don't think so. I don't know. The ideal way surely would be to actually go, in English parlance, to the horse's mouth and find out what it is that those communities want. But therein lies a difficulty of structure. Therein lies a difficulty of access. Perhaps fora like this, perhaps more using social media may become part of the answer in the future. Not at the moment, because various different elements of society still don't have access to that. I would argue that where we've got to is at least a grund norm has been established. That whatever the vagaries might be of culture, whatever the interpretations might be on the minutiae of the detail, the fundamental aspect, the fundamental thrust is to ensure that the inherent dignity and worth of every individual is protected. The rest of it's all up to play. And hopefully we will refine them as we understand the world in which we live better. So I hope that addresses some question. Sarah Franzen, thank you for your question. What systems exist within low to middle income countries that should be sustained, if not enhanced? And which high income countries can adopt to increase sustainability efforts, for instance, small scale farming? The example you give there suggests that you're expecting me to answer the question much more in terms of, I guess, real and tangible aspects like farming. I would, however, suggest to you that my focus tends to be on the social policy mechanisms in place. And in the article that I've suggested you might get something out of for this particular class, you will find that there's close to 40 countries that are mentioned there. Whether that's the Oportunidades program in Mexico, whether that's the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, whether that's the question of registration of births in Vietnam, whether that's the employment guarantee scheme in India. There are a number of these quite small scale individual ventures, really often pushed by individuals who are committed to that particular goal, which we need to find ways of scaling up. Now, first of all, we need to know where they are, because by and large, our educational systems don't tend to focus on those mechanisms. We focus much more on the mechanisms developed in developed countries that we seek to transfer to developing countries. It takes a lot, it takes a Nobel Prize actually, for the Grameen Bank example to necessarily come the other way. So I think in many ways, the challenge will be for us as a community of scholars interested in this question to dig deeper in these countries and find out what it is. Let's start from the premise that many countries and many communities have agitated for their version of sustainable development for a long time. These communities have not waited for Ban Ki-moon on Friday or Saturday or next week to articulate goals. They have tried in their own way to address the human suffering and human condition that they have faced with at their micro scale. And they have come up with some systems. Some of those systems have reinforced power. Some of those systems have reinforced privilege. But other systems have challenged power and have challenged privilege. We don't even know adequately about these systems. It falls to us, I think, to put that deep inquiry using the current tools we have and the access we have to these societies, and to discover those and then examine the extent to which they can be scaled up. So I'm afraid I haven't quite answered your question, which specific ones, but I want to point to the 40-odd examples that are littered across this particular article that you did read. And there are some more examples in an article I wrote in Human Rights Quarterly. I think it's volume 35, which you might be able to look up, which also talks slightly more about political mechanisms to try and focus on inclusion and especially for sustainable for vulnerable groups. Russ, your question then addresses the issue of can peace be perpetually sustained in the face of resource key regional and global resource disparities? Again, an excellent question. I'm going to stop saying that because they've all been very good questions. Can it be perpetually sustained? I don't know the answer to it. I genuinely don't know, and I suspect nobody really does know the answer, because the idea of getting to peace without worrying about these issues is clearly unsustainable. And evidence, the 60-odd years of UN being set up will show you plenty of examples of that. So what we do know is business as usual has not given us perpetual peace. In fact, Hobsbawm would argue it's given us a state of perpetual war. He would argue that we have been in a state of perpetual war since World War II. And again, Eric Hobsbawm is somebody you might want to read in trying to tease that argument out further. So the short answer, Russ, is we don't know if that peace can be perpetually maintained. But what we do know is business as usual haven't given us that. And if we do continue and project business as usual forward, you will see growing disparities. And those global resource disparities you talk about now will in fact grow and will alienate certain communities. And we will be back into the scenario by which Africa and parts of Asia will be looked at, and perhaps parts of Latin America will essentially be looked at resource hotbeds that will ultimately be exploited by the more powerful states to sustain those particular economies. The inevitable consequences, massive global migration of the scale we're already seeing. And that particular element then means that if we don't, in 2015 now, articulate these goals, irrespective of the regional and global resource disparities that exist, we won't be able to tackle it. Perhaps the better way is to tackle those inequalities in and of themselves. But the mechanism for doing that, it doesn't exist at the moment. So at least highlighting the impact they have and addressing that and putting it high enough on the global agenda is, I would argue, the next best alternative. Hopefully that tackles you. Now, Gary, considering the extent of income inequality today and the trends that have been observed over the past 4 decades, how can SDG 10 realistically be carried out between now and 2030? I mean, it's going to be really, really hard, if not impossible. I don't accept impossible in my lexicon because I do think in the end that the systems that we designed have been designed by individual human beings, and those individual human beings need to be tapped on and need to be convinced through the powers of persuasion, through the powers of good argumentation, and I think through pragmatic realism as to why it is that an unequal world that endlessly reproduces itself with more and more acute inequalities is not likely to be the best way forward. Can goal 10 ever be achieved? I don't know, but I do know that failing to articulate it now and put it on the agenda will mean it will never be achieved. And this isn't a quest for me to try and get towards utopia, but it's understanding what utopia might look like. And if we don't understand what utopia might look like, we will not be able to make the urgent structural changes. And I'm talking about structural changes here that we need to be able to seriously tackle the inequality agenda. So perhaps in 2030, if we have a track record that MDG 1 had on poverty, where you've more or less got some success in some places, some not quite getting to half the level of poverty, but it being high on the agenda and something to show for it, that would already be a major improvement, would it not? And so I'm working on the premise that putting this high enough in the agenda and getting states and businesses, remember, we haven't really configured businesses into this equation, getting states, businesses, and other intergovernmental actors into that particular equation will at least start that particular journey that hopefully will arrive at some degree of some real degree of understanding how it is that we can tackle these issues of inequality. I seem to have got Chingwa back online. Chingwa, really sorry that you've missed quite a lot of that, but I hope that you can get the remaining few minutes. So I trust that
Joshua, this is Shiv here.
Shiv, yes.
If you do have the time, maybe you could go for another 5 minutes.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, that would be excellent. Thank you.
So I presume, Shweta, is it you who's highlighting the questions that I need to answer, or are you highlighting them as I answer them?
I am, yeah, as you answer.
So maybe I'll tackle the question from Carolina, who's in Brazil on the MDP program. Carolina, your question transmitted via Peter May asked a question around Goal 5. It says, if Goal 5 deals with gender equality, why doesn't it address the issue of abolishment of prostitution? Now, that's a very, very difficult question to really answer from a global perspective, because you have to bear in mind that these goals cannot get into the intricate detail of how something has to be achieved. There will be a variety of different views on prostitution. There will be a variety of different contexts in which prostitution occurs. Some societies have legalized prostitution. So your question then saying abolishment of prostitution, well, that already falls foul of the fact that in some states prostitution is legal. I don't think the states that have made it legal are necessarily ascribing a moral value to it. I think they are addressing a practical constraint that makes people who work within the sex industry invisible to society. So the premise of your question, let me address the premise of your question rather than the content. The premise of your question is essentially that goals like this can tackle the fine detail. It can't. They never can, because you will never get agreement across the cultural barriers that we've perhaps alluded to in the context of answering some of your questions. You need to necessarily keep the goals broad, and you need to necessarily keep the goals pointing towards an aspiration. Our aspiration in Goal 5 is very much the issue of gender equality. Now, your question is perfectly legitimate, because you could legitimately argue that prostitution flies in the face of gender equality, and I suspect that's why you framed the question. But to answer the question, Goal 5 could never get into that level of detail, because we would simply get then into the question of which one is more important. So some states would argue, well, prostitution isn't as major a question in our society as violence against women. Others would argue that the lack of political participation is the biggest issue. So you'd get then into an almost a wide menu of what you think is the most important issue and whether that aspect is reflected or not. By keeping it broad and by keeping it perhaps anodyne to that extent, focused on equality, the attempt here is to address a wide slew of issues that ultimately result in alleviating the human condition of the particular woman we're talking about in the particular context that's being examined. And that may well be in a Brazilian context, abolishing prostitution, but it may well be in an Indian context, abolishing and finding a much more, I guess, ruthless manner, if that's the appropriate word, to tackle violence against women. So I hope that has addressed your question. Judy, your question then, what is the reason, I'm looking at the time here, yeah. What is the reason having Goal 1, respectively in MDGs and SDGs, to end extreme poverty and end poverty when all the subsequent goals aim at different components of poverty traps? A good question. I mean, in many ways, the rallying call, I think, of the Millennium Promise itself was, can we afford a world going forward where there is this level of disparity? So partly it's historical, partly it's the emphasis of the people who have pushed that particular agenda, with Jeffrey Sachs being at the forefront of it. Partly it's that particular element of trying to avoid the poverty trap. And you're absolutely right. In many ways, all of the other goals hopefully complement that marquee goal. If you are trying to configure and bring states along in a process that will actually target any objective, you need to speak a wide agenda. And that's what the goals try to do. There's 17 of them. They're not ideal. They could be 10. They perhaps ought to have been 8. They perhaps ought to have been configured better. We can, all of those are the many criticisms out there of the SDGs. Many of them I agree with, many of them I don't agree with. But in any case, goal 1 as the marquee goal is the anchoring goal, if you like. And all the other ones are manifestations and different speeches, if you like, to different epistemological communities. So if you just talk about poverty, and I don't mean to denigrate poverty in that way, but if you speak exclusively about poverty, are you making sure really that those who work in the education sphere are necessarily engaged with this task of what it means? In very material terms, the people who work on education tend not to be concerned about the people who work on poverty. So even at that very fundamental level, if you can draw those communities together, you're automatically addressing 2 approaches to the poverty trap rather than 1. And likewise, if you push that forward to the climate change, to agriculture, to biodiversity, these in many ways are different approaches and different attempts to speak to different communities to highlight the fact that ultimately you can't get a sustainable future if you don't address the manifestation of inequality in each of your areas. So partly it's pragmatic in addressing it to different communities. Partly it's pragmatic in addressing it to different realities. So some states might feel they do a great job on protecting biodiversity, but perhaps they don't do as good a job in terms of land tenure systems. You want to make sure the goals have enough there to engage every audience. Unlike the MDGs, which seemed largely to speak to LDCs and perhaps some middle-income countries, the SDGs are trying to speak to everybody. And so in that particular sense, if you're designing this particular basket of goods, you best make sure there's something in it for everyone. And that as a collective, these goals are approached and tackled. So I hope that goes some way towards answering your question there, Judy. Mariana, your question then, it says you have Rachel and Mariana. How do the SDGs attempt to target the issue of the Western way of thinking of keeping up with the Joneses? Very good. In many societies, the rich enjoy their social superiority. How do we change this way of thinking to promote social inclusion? Look, I wish I could give you an answer saying by we will compel the rich to be able to share and share more equitably. That is not a realistic proposition. I think, in a sense, you can't compel. Your powers of compulsion are immediately reduced in the context in which you're in. If you're a developing country, you desperately need corporations to come in and invest to make up for their shortfall in investment. That's part of the poverty trap. So you inevitably then have to get into bed with the devil, so to speak. Yes, there might well be an aspect by which one particular social superiority will then be transferred to another. How do the SDGs tackle this? The SDGs have tried to tackle it by saying everybody has the right to growth. Now that might be problematic. There might well be people out there, and there are critics who will tell you that based with where we are on the planetary boundary question, actually we shouldn't even be encouraging growth. We should be talking much more about redistribution. Redistribution is not an agenda that you will necessarily get any traction with. So I guess the short answer is, with redistribution not a realistic option, you need to find other mechanisms that first of all speak to developing world aspirations for growth, and then speak to developed world aspirations for investment, and try to find some happy ground within it. Do the SDGs do that? Well, the proof of that pudding will lie precisely in the eating, and over the eating very slowly over the 15 years, hopefully in an inclusive manner, I would argue. But essentially, the way of thinking to promote social inclusion can only come to the fore if it's articulated in these particular goals at the highest level and signed on to by the great and the good. If social inclusion remains a quest for the poor and for their few advocates, which is, I think, what it has been so far, it will stay relegated to where it is. I'm not sure that that quest to get the poor's issues addressed in the highest manner is necessarily compatible with the keeping up the Joneses attitude. I'm not sure that's the case. But certainly if you don't put keeping up the Joneses as being something of a goal, you will lose developing countries who will immediately say, so you developed and you exploited the environment while doing so. Now that our turn has come, now that we have our 15 minutes of fame, you've decided to turn the camera off. That's not fair. So in many ways, it's a pragmatic attempt to make sure that you keep the global community as one. at the negotiating table and at the implementing table. But in many ways, it's to highlight and really railroad that message home about the fact that if you don't promote social inclusion, you are actually storing up problems for the future. You're storing up major inequality. You're storing up major instability. You know, I mean, Paul Collier will tell you in his book, The Bottom Billion, he, for instance, talks about a twin-track world. He talks about a 21st century world and a 14th century feudalistic world. The fact is, though, in the 14th century feudalistic world, you can actually get access to 21st century weapons. So the security imperative has become much more accentuated than it perhaps has ever been before. And that is something that we need to pay attention to. So social inclusion has to be a pragmatic way in which we configure social justice and social policy mechanisms. Okay, that's not a question, Lily-Jin. Beijing, we are still online and live. Brilliant, fantastic, thank you very much. Just switched from Skype to Google+. If gender equality is achieved through SDG, what effect will it have to our society and environment? I like this question because it allows us to imagine a better world. So Lily-Jin, I would argue that if we did, we would first of all see a material difference. Those pictures of parliaments, I mean, the NPC is actually pretty good on this, but not many parliaments are. If you looked at those parliaments, you would automatically see a greater representation of society as a whole. You would see more women in parliaments. Hopefully, you would see a greater emphasis then on the entirety of the human condition and not just the experience of a small set of them, which is what in large part, many world parliaments are skewed towards. I do this sometimes. I get my students to imagine that first Athenian democracy. I say to them, imagine that you could have a grainy black and white photograph of that first meeting. And imagine if you could take a magnifying glass and get up close with all those people there. What would you find they had in common? Well, two things you'd notice immediately. One, they would all be men. Secondly, they'd all be landowners. So in many ways, the way in which politics has been configured is that the rules have been set by the powerful to protect the interests of the powerful. That doesn't give us social justice. That gives us order. And it gives us an order that if it's unjust, will be guaranteed to be unjust structurally into the future. This particular aspect on goal 5 and your specific question on gender for me is a key element there in asking that particular question. It's not premised on my part by any belief that women will necessarily be better at it than men. They might well be, but it will at least be broader. That's a start. And that agenda being configured, taken away from the narrow 1% male to the wider, even if it's just the 1%, men and women, will be a major start. Then ensuring that other vulnerable groups, minorities, indigenous peoples are represented will be an improvement. If you think about your own NPC, China has what, 7.3% roughly national minorities, but the NPC, when you look at it, has really nearly 9% representation of minorities and indigenous peoples. Now, does that in and of itself give us a better global justice? I don't think it does, but that's certainly a starting point. If it's a starting point, of course, it's an even better starting point when the discussions flow freely on policy issues. So that hopefully gives you some idea, and I'm glad to know that Beijing is still with us. So thank you for your question and that comment, Lily. Moving to the question of Shiv, yes?
I think we need to
wind up.
Yes. Very sorry about this.
Not at all. I actually need to run. I'm late for my meeting, so I didn't want to
Thank you very much, Joshua. What all of us have heard, both in class as well as over the MDP network, is a really brilliant exegesis, almost not of any kind of abstract kind of legal instrument, but kind of a practical read of the world, of how the legal intersects with the development world, and what we are trying to do in order to change it through the SDGs. So thank you very much. Thank you again for taking so much time. And what I would like to request is, since you're coming to New York, and we have this really great international conference on sustainable development held by the MDP network, would you care to come by, even if it's only for 20 minutes? So both folks from Columbia, as well as many of the students who come from other parts of the world, get a chance to at least say hello.
I would love to do that. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Joshua. So I'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for engaging with me, colleagues. Brilliant.
Lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.